It started on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the air felt crisp and the horizon was just starting to shimmer with heat. I'd been up since dawn, like always, feeding the cattle and checking the fences along the north pasture. Out here, your land is everything. It's not just dirt and grass, it's years of sweat, generations of stories, and the quiet kind of pride that doesn't need to be spoken aloud. That's why, when I crested the hill and saw the machinery, I thought I was still half asleep. There they were, two backhoes, a dump truck, and a crew of men in matching safety vests, all of them working like they owned the place. Stakes were in the ground, bright orange survey tape fluttering in the breeze, and the steady beep 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 of reversing equipment cut through the stillness. At first, my brain tried to come up with some innocent explanation. Maybe the county had sent someone to fix a utility line, maybe a neighbor's contractor had gotten lost. But the further I walked, the clearer it got. These men weren't here by mistake. They were digging holes for what looked suspiciously like foundation work. I spotted the foreman, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, looking as smug as a man can when he thinks the world bends to his will. I asked him what exactly he thought he was doing on my property, and he didn't even hesitate. He said they were breaking ground for a new HOA development. Phase 1 of the Westfield Estates, he called it, like he was reciting from a brochure. I told him, slowly, that this was my ranch, private property, not part of any subdivision, and certainly not up for grabs. He flipped through his papers and gave me a look that said he thought I was the one who didn't understand reality. Turns out, the HOA from the neighboring gated community had decided to expand. They'd bought some adjacent parcels from other folks who'd been ready to sell, but apparently somewhere along the way, they either misinterpreted the boundary lines or decided they didn't care. My land was clearly marked on county records, but that didn't seem to matter to them. They were halfway through digging a trench that cut across my grazing pasture. I told them to stop. They didn't. One of the workers shrugged and said they had permits they claimed gave them the right to be here. The foreman even waved a stack of papers at me like they were some kind of magic spell. I told him unless those papers had my signature on them, they meant nothing on my land. He smirked and said, "Well, you can take it up with the HOA board." That was the wrong answer. I turned around, walked back to the house, and called my brothers. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when someone tries to pull something like this. By the time I'd explained what was happening, my phone had already lit up with messages from friends who'd spotted the same trucks on their way in. Everyone knew the HOA folks had been itching to beautify the countryside, which was code for paving over pastureland and putting up McMansions. We just hadn't expected them to try it without permission. It didn't take long for my brothers to show up, and when they did, they weren't alone. A few neighbors rolled in, too, some in dusty pickups, some on horseback. We weren't looking for trouble, but we also weren't about to let someone bulldoze our land while we stood by. Out here, the unspoken rule is simple. You take care of your own, and you stand together when outsiders come sniffing around. I won't lie, there were guns. Not because we wanted to scare anyone unnecessarily, but because that's how we live. It's rural land, there are coyotes, wild hogs, and sometimes less friendly intruders. Most of us had rifles slung over our shoulders or sidearms on our hips, it's just part of the day. But to those HOA workers, it was like they'd stumbled into some old Western standoff. You could see their bravado melt as they realized they weren't dealing with paperwork and polite phone calls anymore. We didn't point anything at them, didn't threaten them, just stood there, quiet and solid, letting them know the conversation was over. I told the foreman again, clearly, that they had no legal right to be here, and if they didn't pack up, we'd be calling the sheriff. His eyes darted to the line of trucks and men behind me, then back to his crew. One of them had already shut off the backhoe, and another was peeling up the survey tape. They might have come in thinking they were untouchable, but now they were realizing just how far from their HOA bylaws they really were. The foreman muttered something about miscommunication and checking with the board, but I could tell his confidence was gone. The crew loaded up their tools faster than I thought possible, like they couldn't get out of there quick enough. That beep 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 of their trucks was almost comical now, a retreat instead of an advance. By the time the dust settled, all that was left were a few half-dug holes and tire tracks cutting into the grass. We stood there for a while after they left, just watching the road, making sure they didn't come back. The sheriff eventually showed up. Someone must have called him, and when he heard the story, he shook his head and said he'd be talking to the HOA about trespassing charges. He wasn't surprised, either. Apparently, this wasn't the first time they'd tried something like this, though it was the first time they'd picked the wrong landowner to mess with. I spent the rest of the day walking the property lines, making sure everything was intact. My brothers helped me mark fresh signs along the fence, bright, bold warnings that left no room for misinterpretation. As the sun started to sink, I looked out across the pasture and felt that familiar swell of stubborn pride. They might have thought we were just a patch of dirt waiting to be developed, but this land has roots deeper than any HOA's ambitions. And if they ever forgot that again, well, they'd remember real quick. Alright, here's a 1,000-word expansion for part 2 of your story, keeping it immersive and cinematic while avoiding any overly graphic depictions. By the time we turned off the dirt road and onto the north pasture, I could see the movement from a mile away. Yellow machinery glinting in the sun, dust clouds swirling, and a couple dozen figures scattered across the slope like ants on a picnic. My gut tightened. This wasn't just someone wandering onto my property. They were digging. From the cab of my truck, I could see where the first posts were already hammered into the soil. They had staked out a rectangle big enough to fit a clubhouse or maybe a couple of model homes. Rolls of plastic fencing lay coiled like snakes in the grass, ready to unspool. It was surreal. This was the ranch my family had worked for decades, and here they were, acting like they owned it. We slowed to a crawl, and I caught my brother's eye. He didn't have to say a word. We'd grown up out here, fixing fences, running cattle, watching sunsets bleed into star-drenched skies. The land wasn't just dirt and grass, it was our livelihood, our history, our roots. Someone coming in and digging it up without permission felt like they were tearing pages out of a family album. We pulled up close enough that the workers started noticing us. A few glanced over and went right back to hammering. Others hesitated, watching us through narrowed eyes. One man in a polo shirt and mirrored sunglasses strode over like he was in charge, a clipboard in hand. "Can I help you?" he asked, like we were the ones trespassing. "You can start by explaining why you're on our ranch," I said, stepping out of the truck. My boots crunched in the dry grass. My voice was calm, but I could feel the heat building in my chest. "This is part of the HOA's community expansion project," he replied smoothly, flipping through papers. "Everything's been approved. You're welcome to review the plans." I cut him off. "Approved by who? Certainly not us. This is private property, and you're in violation of more laws than I care to count right now." He smirked like he'd been through this before. "Actually, we've got a legal right." That's when my brother stepped out of the truck too, resting his hand casually on the lever-action rifle slung across his shoulder. He didn't raise it, didn't even point it, just stood there with that old-school rancher's look that says, "You've made a bad decision and you still have time to fix it." The effect was immediate. The clipboard guy's voice caught in his throat. Around us, I could hear the whir of machinery start to wind down. A bulldozer operator killed the engine, climbing out of the cab to see what was going on. Someone dropped a hammer in the dirt. I walked a little closer, making sure my voice carried. "You have 30 seconds to start packing up your things before we start calling the sheriff and trespassing charges start stacking up. This is not HOA land. This is a working ranch. You've got no right to be here." A younger guy near the fence post shouted something about property lines, and my brother laughed, a slow, humorless chuckle that made it clear we weren't in the mood for debates about survey maps. "This land has been in our family since before your HOA even existed," he said. We know every fence post, every rock, every stream. And you're standing on it. The clipboard man's confidence was starting to crack. He looked back at his crew, then at us, then down at his papers like they might magically give him a way out. The air was thick, part dust, part tension. I took out my phone and held it up. Smile for the camera. This'll go nicely with the police report. That's when it happened. The bravado drained out of the group almost all at once. A couple of them muttered curses and started loading tools into trucks. The bulldozer operator climbed back into his cab and began reversing, careful to avoid tearing up more ground. One woman who'd been unrolling fencing dropped the spool like it was hot to the touch and walked away fast. Clipboard man took a step back. Look, there's no need for this to get confrontational. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding. Oh, there's no misunderstanding, I said. You just figured you could push us around. But we don't bend easy out here. The crew scattered quicker than I expected. Trucks rumbled to life. Machinery clanged shut. Within minutes, the swarm that had been digging into our land was retreating in a haphazard convoy down the dusty trail. I stood there watching them go, feeling the adrenaline begin to drain, leaving behind that hollow mix of relief and lingering anger. When the dust finally settled, we walked the site. Fresh holes gaped in the soil, a few broken posts still leaning awkwardly. Deep tread marks from heavy machinery carved ugly scars across the pasture. I knelt down, ran my fingers through the disturbed dirt, and felt a pang. Fixing this would take time and money, filling the holes, smoothing the land so cattle wouldn't trip and break a leg. My brother was scanning the horizon. They'll be back, he said matter-of-factly. People like that don't just quit. I nodded. Then we'll be ready. Over the next couple of hours, we photographed everything, every hole, every set of tire tracks, every discarded piece of fencing. We sent the photos straight to the sheriff's office along with a full written statement. The deputy I spoke to didn't sound surprised. Apparently, the HOA had been a thorn in a lot of people's sides lately, but this was the boldest move yet. By the time we headed back to the house, the sun was dipping low, painting the hills gold. I could see the faint glimmer of headlights far off where the HOA convoy had disappeared. Somewhere out there, they were probably already talking about negotiations and compromises. They didn't seem to understand that out here, land isn't just an investment or a phase of development. It's the backbone of a family. You defend it, the way you'd defend your own blood. And if that meant they'd run crying the moment we showed up, well, maybe that was the first smart thing they'd done all day. If you'd like, I can also write a part 3 where the HOA tries a different tactic, one that's sneakier and more bureaucratic than sending a construction crew. That could set up a tense follow-up confrontation. Do you want me to continue with that next?